handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2 1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4 7 tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGBT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. Very happy that you could stay along for the ride here. Ethan Blevins is with us with the Pacific Legal Foundation, and we're going to talk about a case that I think has wide-ranging implications if it gets some legs coming out of Seattle. Of course, these things just always seem to have a genesis. They're born in Seattle. I guess the people, the government in Washington State just is going after all kinds of landlords and property owners and expansions and all those kinds of things. But yeah, Ethan's going to explain a fun case with us. So Ethan, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we have the city council that has, it looks like it's passed a handful of city ordinances that are really affecting landlords. And this could be landlords of any kind, I would say, not just somebody who owns a home that they use for a rental property, but also landlords that own apartment buildings. Would that be right?
Yes, these are laws that apply across the board.
Okay, so what we have here is you are representing a Kelly Lyles, is that right?
Yes, Kelly and a few other small.
A few others.
Like
okay. And so what is happening is, I guess the first part of the lawsuit is kind of a first in, must accept application. So if you get an application from a potential tenant, the landlord is almost like they're forced to accept that application and grant them tenancy. Would that be right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this was a part of what the city called its first-in-time rule, which means that a landlord advertises for a unit. You know, somebody walks in the door the next day, hands you an application, and if it's an adequate application, you just have to offer the unit to that person. You can't, if you're worried about that person's history, or they're rude to you, or for any other number of reasons you might be concerned about them, you would have to rent to that individual. We actually got that rule overturned in court just a month ago, and then we've got this other law. As you say, there's a number of laws that Seattle has rolled out over the last couple of years that we're currently challenging.
All right, so this almost tells me that a landlord or a property owner cannot do a background check on an applicant.
Right, yeah. So this is the current lawsuit that we just filed, kind of as a follow-up to that first-in-time law. So the city passed what it called the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance last year, I think in August. And the Fair Chance Housing Ordinance says, well, we want to help these guys coming out of prison to reintegrate into society. So we are going to forbid landlords from asking for a criminal background check or denying someone housing because of their criminal background. And it doesn't matter how grave the offense was, how horrible the crime involved was, you can't deny someone tenancy because of that criminal background. You can't even ask about it.
Wow. So if something happens, if the landlord says, okay, if I comply and I have to do this, and they lease, their property to a convicted felon that is now out on parole or has served his time or her time, and something else happens, there is a child molestation, there is an armed robbery, there is an armed intrusion, a kidnapping, then the victim of that can necessarily go back to that landlord and said, you brought this person into our neighborhood, right?
That's right. There's a case right now out of Illinois that is exactly like that, where a landlord did not do a criminal background check. The tenant that he rented to tragically killed another tenant in the building. And then that family sued the landlord for failing to do a criminal background check that would have told them that this guy had a really violent history.
Kind of to throw some sand in the gears, this seems to have some implications too when it comes to people that might qualify for, are applying for a mortgage and to buy a home. So I would think even the lender, or, because I can think of any apartment complex has probably got some kind of a big, loan on it. So, they could have some kind of implication, or if, just a normal mortgage bank. I think they ask those kinds of questions too. So this could have some further implications, could it?
I think it definitely does, and those are somewhat yet to be seen, right? But I think for sure the things we know are, especially for our clients here, is that small-time landlords renting in Seattle already are taking a big risk. It's just it's a risky business to be involved in already, and to not allow them to get the basic information they need to protect their investment is, I think, really an insult and a major burden on their property rights and their individual rights, and to say that their personal safety and the safety of their other tenants is less important than the city council's, intentions to help these guys reintegrate into society. I think it's just so offensive to the constituents that the city of Seattle supposedly is serving.
Well, what does Seattle say about public safety? I mean, was that even raised when this ordinance happened?
It has been raised, and they've been mostly silent about it. There are interest groups that have been bending the city council's ear for years and years, and and those interest groups have said something about it, which is basically just totally to dismiss it and say, oh, this doesn't happen. These guys are good tenants. There's no evidence that landlords are going to face any risk from renting these individuals, which is flat out false, and I think totally disingenuous. The city council itself, I think, seems to recognize that that's not true, that there is a serious safety concern, and so instead of addressing it, they've just been silent.
A landlord is a business owner. I mean, when you get right down to it, I mean, they have an investment and they want to protect their investment. And so from a property aesthetics, from a property value, they really would use normal, reasonable, and customary practices in looking at applications. I mean, an application doesn't mean that it's automatically accepted. It is an application by a potential tenant. So a business owner and or landlord would, I mean, they have a responsibility to their own investment way far beyond, some kind of criminal background. I mean, even from an ability to pay on their rental fees, right?
Well, absolutely, and often these are, at least with the people that we're representing, these are families, these are individuals who are using that investment to take care of their kids, college funds. And these aren't people who are in it to make a buck at any cost. They're just trying to take care of their families. They're trying to afford to live in a very expensive city, and this is how they're doing it. And so the city doesn't seem to care about their concerns at all. They just seem so bent on helping who they see as the vulnerable among them that they're just willing to throw everybody else to the curb.
Is there an implication, Ethan, when it comes to what these landlords can actually charge for rent in these ordinances?
Well, thankfully, in the state, we do have a ban on rent control, and I think that's one of the reasons you see all these other crazy ordinances out and about, because the city is trying to figure out other ways to, to screw over landlords, basically. And so, what happens though with all of these things is that rent gets driven up, because if you can no longer find out whether somebody has a criminal background, you're going to use other tools to try to filter out people, whether it be increasing the credit score you're going to require, or whether it be raising your rent. Not only are you going to raise your rent to try to filter out bad apples, but you also raise your rent to cover the risk that's created. You got to create a cushion now, because you have less control over who's going to be on your property. There's going to be more risk that's going to get damaged, or that you're going to be out a few months' rent. So all of a sudden we see rent increasing in the city of Seattle. We see landlords withdrawing from the rental market when we already have what the city itself has called an affordability crisis. So all of this stuff just drives up cost in a city where we can't afford that.
Well, we're certainly seeing that in places like San Francisco and other parts of California too. So it almost looks like Seattle and San Francisco are kind of in lockstep with this, because I see some of this move. Now, these landlords, or these property owners, let's put it that way, they would necessarily, in order to comply, they'd end up having to put out some other bigger dollars to have some kind of liability insurance, if they could get liability insurance based on the vulnerabilities of this, right?
Absolutely, yeah. And the clients that we're representing, one of them, Kelly Lyles, who you mentioned, Kelly relies almost exclusively on her monthly rent from her small West Seattle house that she rents out. She relies on that almost exclusively for all her living expenses. She's older, she's an artist, she doesn't make a lot of money. She can't afford stuff like liability insurance. What we've said again and again is what you're doing, what the city of Seattle is doing, is making this a climate in which the small-time landlord cannot operate. And instead, you're going to have private management companies coming in, scooping up these properties, because they're the only ones who can do things like get liability insurance and create the cushion needed to deal with the risk. So ironically, the city of Seattle supposedly hates big companies like private rental companies, and those guys drive up costs a lot too. And yet that's exactly what they're ushering in. The private small-time landlord steps out because they can't handle the heat anymore. And now all we have are the impersonal big management companies that just drive up costs.
Yeah, property management. So then what ends up happening is that potentially this tenant is not taking care of the cutting the grass, which might be written into the lease, or they're just destroying stuff, or and those costs are hurting the landlord, and so the landlord's then forced to go use a management company kind of as a buffer, and they can't afford that either. So I mean, if they're making if they're clearing $300 a month in some kind of net revenue from being a landlord, then they end up taking a large portion of that and paying it off to a land or a property management company, right?
Right, and most of them can't do that, and that's why a lot of them are just bowing out entirely. They're selling their property, or they're just changing the use so that it's no longer up in the residential housing market at all. So
Pacific Legal prevailed in the case in March on the first in time application part of the ordinance, correct?
Right. Yes.
All right. So as a consequence of winning that, is there a effort to rewrite some kind of ordinance on this first-in-time mandate?
I don't know. I doubt it at this point because the city has filed a notice of appeal on that decision, lower court decision. So we'll be going through the appeals process now. With that, they've got an uphill climb. They were issued such a scathing loss by the trial court. I think it's going to be really difficult for them to win on appeal. In the meantime, though, they're cooking up. It doesn't stop them. They're cooking up all kinds of other things. They imposed shortly, after the first-in-time victory we had, they imposed a moratorium, for example, on certain websites that allow landlords and tenants to bid on rent. So they said, we don't like these websites, we're going to ban them.
What?
And so they just continue to move forward. It doesn't seem at this point that we are reducing their sort of their momentum towards basically a socialized housing market. We'll still be there. They all of these are what they proudly call first of its kind legislation, and that's true. But that's not something that they really should be proud of. There's a reason these things haven't been tried, because it's so contrary to our capitalist form of economy and our sort of individual rights-based system of government. You can't just say, hey, we're going to impose this massive burden on a segment of society in order to help out other guys. That's just contrary to the way we operate. And that's why these are first of its kind, and I hope last of its kind, in all these efforts.
So Seattle is really taking kind of a civil rights position against legitimate landowners, right? I mean, they're trying to do under the guise of civil rights, in a high tide, all boats rise, meaning that any kind of person with a criminal background gets a level playing field, and that these landlords, can't consider criminal histories at all. But I would say, there are lots of websites out there that you can go do some kind of a background check and get whatever it is that you can. Is there some kind of a fee or penalty or jail time if a landlord gets caught doing that?
Yeah, so the first offense will cost you $11,000. Multiple offenses are going to come up to $55,000 per offense. And so it's not a slap on the wrist by any means. It's just we landlords are people just like the Seattle City Council, and yet the assumption made behind all of this legislation is that these guys are out to get the little guy. They don't want to help the little guy. That landlords are going to be bigots. They're going to discriminate against somebody because of criminal background. My experience, talking to so many landlords in these cases is the opposite. That these landlords want to do good with what this stewardship that they have. They see it as an opportunity to help people. They're not going to. They don't discriminate. The vast majority. They're willing to give somebody a break if they have a criminal background, so long as it's not going to pose a threat to them or their other tenants, who they also feel responsibility for. So I'm not a landlord, but I personally feel offended by the city council's assumption that they know better than the landlord, first of all, and that the landlords are just out to get you, and that they don't want to help, and they're only looking out for their own bottom line.
Has these city councils, I would say at some point that these landlords ought to force some kind of indemnity, that they are not responsible then for anything that happens, and that anything that happens needs to go back and becomes the financial / criminal / fraudulent burden of the city council. Is that way over the top?
Oh, I would love to see that. Hopefully we win on this so quickly that we don't have a situation where a landlord, is facing liability and then has to try to indemnify the city. But absolutely, what that points out is that you've got a problem when the city council members aren't going to be the ones that have to shoulder the burden of this. They're just thrusting that burden onto somebody else. So to force it back on them in some way and make them pay for the destroyed property or the liability for injury, or even, unfortunately, something as horrible as a murder, that should rest with the city council. They're the ones imposing the burden. Unfortunately, I don't think an indemnification argument would work, but what it does is it points out the hypocrisy, right, that goes on here.
It's almost as though you're not allowed now to put a private property sign on the property.
Yeah, I mean, it is like this is no longer private.
Exactly.
The city, with regard to the first in time rule, they just said, well, once you've decided to rent out your property, you have entirely abandoned your rights to exclude at all. So you can no longer exclude anybody. It's like turning it into a shopping mall or something. And what we said is that means that the residential housing market just is no longer private at all. It's like he's taken public ownership of the entire private residential housing market. And that's how these laws have essentially operated. And I think that's unfortunately the way the city council sees it.
Is this kind of law, this kind of ordinance, any place else in the country that you're aware of?
No, at the time of its passage, the city, clearly touted it as the first, and there hasn't been something similar since it. There are some things that are a little less drastic. I mean, this isn't the Wild West. The criminal background checks have been regulated for a long time. So, excuse me. For example, federal HUD guidelines say, since 2016, landlords have to make an individual assessment of a person's criminal background. So they can't just say if nobody with past felonies will be accepted. You can't make that kind of blanket ban. You have to look at the background of the offense and kind of make an individual determination. So this is a world where we're already pretty regulated. Nothing nearly as extreme as the city of Seattle law.
Sex offenders have to be registered. I'm wondering, is that still the case in Seattle?
Yes, at least there's that. But because of this law, landlords can't do much about that. All they'll see is, oh, you're registered, and then they're kind of helpless to do anything about that. But that is the one area where the city of Seattle made the smallest concession, which isn't really a concession at all. And the law does say if somebody's on a sex offender registry and they committed that crime as an adult, that put them on the registry, then if you prove to the Civil Rights Office that you have a legitimate business reason for not renting to that person, then we'll allow you to deny that person housing. But the reality is that landlords aren't going to feel comfortable renting to that person, knowing that it's up to the Civil Rights Office to decide whether or not they had a good reason to do so or not.
Suppose that the landlord wants to take a family member in over some of these applicants. They got 2 or 3 applicants, and then 3 days later, a niece comes in and she's just graduated from college and needs a place to live because she just got a job. Can they just negate all those applications for the sake of a family member?
No. Cool. Under the first in time rule, there's no going back. Once you've put the property out there, you can't withdraw it from the market. Either because maybe any number of circumstances could pop up where you decide, I don't want to rent this anymore, or I want to rent it to a family member, like you say. But with the first in time rule, which thankfully is no longer being enforced right now, pending what happens on appeal, you just once you put it out there on the market, you just have to take whatever comes. You can't withdraw it anymore.
Ethan, this is awful.
I agree, but the good thing is that I think even a progressive place like Seattle is starting to push back. I've seen so much pushback, specifically with these laws, where people say, I'm progressive, but I'm not that progressive, or whatever this thing is. So I think the city council is starting to step beyond even its very liberal constituents.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, please travel on over to pacificlegal.org, and the case is called YIM versus the YIM versus the City of Seattle. It is a fascinating case, and I think that because of whatever successes that Seattle has had, it could flow into some other cities like San Francisco, and we could be in a world of hurt. So you guys have to win all this, all right?
That's the plan.
All right. Thank you, Ethan, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Fascinating case, and we're going to keep up with it.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. There's more coming your way, so stay with us.
Hi, this is Captain Matt Bruce from the Captain's America Third Watch, and you're listening to Talk America Radio, the new dominant force in conservative talk radio.
Hi, this is Donna Fiducia.
And Don Newen from Cowboy Logic Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't go to sleep every night completely fatigued from trying to restore America from the destruction that is taking place,
then you're simply not doing enough. Join us every Tuesday night, 9 p.m. Eastern, for Cowboy Logic Radio.
Let the restoration begin.
Donald Trump came to Washington vowing to drain the swamp and make government work for the American people. But the swamp creatures in D.C. aren't going down without a fight, and the deep state is determined to overturn the election and keep their gravy train rolling. In these turbulent times, it's critical for patriots to stay engaged and be prepared to defend this president. You can stay up to date on Trump's battle to make America great again by listening to America First Radio with Jim Dawes each weeknight at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Liberty Feed.
Hi, it's Mark Walters from Armed American Radio. You know, for nearly a decade, I've been educating, informing, and entertaining responsibly armed Americans. And during that time together, we've shared some ups and downs, haven't we? Trump's election saved our Supreme Court and no doubt the future of our gun rights for now. But now is not the time to lay down. The enemies of freedom are well-funded and more determined than ever. To keep up with the state of your gun rights, make sure to tune in to Armed American Radio right here on Talk America Radio, the new dominant voice in conservative talk radio.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia. And WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
And thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us here on the Denise Simon Experience. Really going to change gears here because it was a couple of weeks ago that I hosted Linda Wall on the show talking about her friendship with Linda Miller and the daughter Isabella. This was a case where Linda Miller, the biological mother of Isabella, had to flee the country because of court rulings taking her child away from her to give it to her ex-partner, who had really no biological or legal rights to the daughter. And this case has been going on a very long time. So going to follow up on it to kind of give you some more information. I've been joined by Philip Zohhiates, and Philip had a interaction with this case as well. The case is still not over with, so Philip can't talk about certain parts of this, but he will certainly share what he can. So with that, Philip, thanks for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you.
I can't think of a legal case. Of course, I don't watch there's thousands and millions of them out there that is any more really sad and disgusting as this one is. But what's particularly interesting, before we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of it, is it was just this week that there's a lot of unrest going on in Nicaragua. And Linda Miller and her daughter are supposed to be still in Nicaragua, correct?
I have no idea.
Okay, all right. Well, from what I keep reading, that's where they initially went for, some kind of safety, and for certainly the safety of Isabella, who I think is going to be about 16 years old this month. Is that right?
I would think somewhere around there, yes.
Okay. Now, your role in this was really essentially following a real Christian doctrine here, and that was to, help out somebody that was really exercising their faith, and you were doing the same. Did I get that right? I know. Yeah. Say what you can.
Yeah, I definitely would sympathize with Lisa and what she was going through. The fact that basically, it was court-ordered sexual abuse. When you come right down to it.
From Lisa's former partner, correct?
Correct. Right.
Okay. Kind of give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch, if you would, so we can kind of refresh the listeners.
The family court, when this all came up, they refused to acknowledge that because this was all a political issue, and they wanted to bring down the Virginia Marriage Affirmation Act and the Federal Doma, and this was the case that they had intended on doing that with. And when the allegations of sexual abuse came up in visitations, the judge in Vermont squashed it because of the political ramifications.
And it was, in fact, real enough that Isabella had to seek counseling for this when she did have visitations with the former partner, lesbian partner, or I guess lesbian partner, right?
I've heard that, yes.
Okay. So this, I guess, from a custody standpoint, that part of this battle, this legal battle, is over, because the judge gave custody to the non-biological ex-partner.
Yeah, I think that happened in January of 2010 after Lisa had already left the country.
Oh, it did happen after that. Okay. And so now we have a condition by which Lisa is still in certainly legal jeopardy because she has been found guilty, and I don't want to say this out of turn, but she's been found guilty of adult kidnapping. Is that how it's packaged?
No, an international parental kidnapping, yes. And I was charged and convicted of aiding and abetting and conspiracy to commit international kidnapping, 2 charges, for which I received a 6-year prison sentence, 3 of which are going to run concurrently, so I have to spend 3 years in prison. My appeal was heard April 9th in New York City at the 2nd Federal Appellate Court, and so I'm just waiting for the decision now.
How long would that take, do you think?
I have no idea. It could take a month or 2. It could take a year.
But, Lisa actually reached out to, several people to help her out. So you are not the lone, I guess, in the eyes of the court, the lone culprit in all of this. There were,
Well, Ken Miller was sentenced to prison. Ken Miller's a pastor here in Virginia of an Amish Beachy Mennonite church. And he was sentenced and spent 2 years in prison, served his sentence, and he's been released now. All of us are also victims of, or there's a number of people, organizations, even Liberty University, that are victims of a civil suit by Janet Jenkins, basically
the ex-partner.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, saying that we have violated her parental rights or something like that, which is really a frivolous suit, but she has an army of Southern Poverty Law Center attorneys helping her out.
Which I guess are doing that on a pro bono basis. Is that right?
Of course.
Now, obviously, I'm thinking here because I've read the stuff over at Southern Poverty Law Center, which, after you kind of know some of the nuts and bolts of this case, the way, it's written up over there, you can kind of the takeaway is that they are against any kind of individual religious belief and adhering to that. I mean, they just have no use for it. And anybody's religion or parental rights are subject to the attack of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they're relentless at this, including, I would say, your case, among others, with the civil side, correct?
Yes, that would be correct.
And they have some very, very deep pockets over there. You and I, Linda, I think, is even part of the civil case, correct?
That's correct. She's a co-defendant.
So is this where are we in the legal process on the civil suit?
Well, the civil case was put on hold until after my trial, which was in September 2016, and where I was convicted. After I was convicted, the judge lifted the stay in the civil case. So that's now they're just going through all the motions, all the attorneys and so forth. But that's getting close to discovery phase. So that's where it is.
And your legal representation, you're paying for this out of pocket?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct. My legal bills have been over $1 million so far.
Unbelievable. Where the ex-partner is not really having to pay for anything. So, I mean, this thing is
That's
just
correct.
way out of balance here, Philip.
Yeah. There's somebody that set up a legal defense fund for me. It's a website called www.419fund.com.
All right. Well, I'm glad to know that. At least there might be some help, but I mean, $1 million is a lot. Philip, did you and the others ever think that it would ever come to something like this?
Well, it's just a sad commentary on our country that it could ever come to this, and the fact that the church has been by and large silent. I mean, even with the Obergefell decision, when that came down, and this happened long before that. But I mean, the church has been silent. I've had very respected, very Christian leaders say, "Well, now that it's the law." Well, it's not the law. The courts can't make law. Congress made a law, and said that we had the federal DOMA, and
the Defense of Marriage Act.
Yes, Defense of Marriage Act. Yet the Supreme Court basically struck that down and created something that can't happen. I mean, you can't have a marriage between homosexuals. It's not physically possible.
It's a pathetic condition where the heads of all of the different denominations haven't at least offered amicus briefs to the court.
Yeah, I had one in my case. I had one brief filed by a group called Conservative Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Mm-hmm.
All of the Christian legal groups have basically run from this case because it's a criminal case. They say, "Oh, we'll only help in civil cases, not criminal cases." But the fact is, I mean, there's people going to jail for their faith in America today,
Correct.
And I'm one of them. Unless God intervenes, and I believe He will intervene, but it's going to take a lot of voices complaining to the Justice Department, complaining to the President that this just is not right.
It's certainly not right. And we've seen case after case. In fact, I have interviewed some lawyers, one in particular with regard to the football coach in Washington State who was fired from his job for praying on the 50-yard line. And then we have several cases with military members that have been disciplined and whatnot for practicing their faith. So, Trump has signed and I don't know what the titles are of executive orders or legislation, protecting religious beliefs by individuals, but that doesn't seem to have the effect that in the case that you need and or Lisa Miller needs, correct?
Well, our cases were already in play, and Lisa Miller hasn't been convicted. I mean, she has a warrant out for arrest, and
she does.
So she hasn't heard her trial yet. So you can't really say she's been found guilty at this point because she hasn't had a trial. But yeah, you're correct. But then all the egregious things that were done under Obama and those of us who have been targeted, they haven't undone that. The prosecutors are still in place. The people that are doing this in the Department of Justice are still there. They could undo this very quickly. They could stop the prosecution, but they're not. And it's going to take people calling the White House, writing letters, writing the Department of Justice, writing Jeff Sessions in particular, to put an end to this. And you look at Romans chapter 1, and it talks about all of the sins of society, and it gets down to the very last verse 32, and it says, not just those who are deserving, or not just those who are doing these things are deserving of death, but those who approve them. And that's a whole lot of people in the church today that they're approving this kind of thing with their silence. And we just, that's got to stop. And there is an answer. I mean, the answer is Jesus Christ. I mean, that's why he died on the cross for our sins. But we need to speak out in this country. We were based on Christian. Our nation is based on Christian principles. Our laws are based on the Bible, and we need to recognize biblical values as the authority that they are in our laws. I mean, they always have been, and they should be. And that's what our Constitution is based on. Our Constitution is being violated time after time after time, and the church just sits on its hands and does nothing.
That's probably, to me, one of the more disturbing things, and I would say because of the remnants of the Eric Holder Justice Department in the Obama administration, because they applied a lot of punitive penalties to those. I mean, when the Obama administration even sued the Little Sisters of the Poor, I mean, right. we're in trouble. Yeah. And I mean, trouble that I don't think anybody has really encapsulated into a full-blown presentation that makes an argument that would be quite profound to legislators, to Congress, and yet there hasn't even been a congressional hearing on anything like this.
No, Congress is quite. It's quite disappointing to watch Congress, and I mean they don't. I mean, Congress, they are the lawmakers. We have three equal branches of government, yet Congress, to their own fault, they have basically submitted to the other branches. And it's time they stop that. They carry the power of the purse. They could cut off funding, but you gotta. It's all politics. It's all if I do this, I won't get reelected. It's time we had people of principle in there. The problem is that people of principle are being targeted. Indeed. Those who stand up against the corruption, they're being targeted, just like I am.
So if the power of the pen of, let's say, that President Trump, if he issues a pardon here for Lisa, would that kind of neutralize the civil case and process? And even when it comes to Ken Miller, if he issues Ken Miller a pardon,
well, he definitely could. He could issue Ken Miller a pardon.
Okay.
I'm not sure about myself because I haven't served any prison time yet. I don't understand all that. If you go on the DOJ website, it says you have to have been in prison for 2 years in order to apply for a pardon.
Okay.
So, yet you had President Ford give a pardon to President Nixon, who was never even tried. So I don't understand how all that works.
Well, but Trump issued a pardon to Joe Arpaio, who didn't serve a day, I don't think, right?
I'm not sure if he was in prison or not. I've wondered that myself.
And that was really, I think, a misdemeanor.
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure that President Trump could intervene in this case. I'm certain of it. I mean, for one thing, he could put pressure on the Justice Department.
Who could have a meeting, somebody at this Justice Department could have a meeting with the White House and say, look, we got this case here. And with this case, you could ring a lot of bells out there that need to be rung. So, I mean, I'm not convinced that this White House knows about this entire case and all of the moving parts to it. So that you're right. I think it is a responsibility of this Justice Department. Or do you think Jeff Sessions is even aware of the case, or do you think it's in some obscure department in Justice?
I have no idea. I know people have written letters to both President Trump and Attorney General Sessions. I don't know if they've ever gotten to them. They say only a percentage of the letters ever make it to the president's desk. So I don't know about the Department of Justice.
In the meantime, Lisa really cannot come back to the United States, and neither can Isabella, correct?
Oh, well, that would be their decision, but the moment she stepped foot in the United States, they'd arrest her.
Even if she applied for some kind of asylum or refugee status in her own country?
Well, I don't know about that. But we serve a mighty God. I serve a mighty God, and I mean, for me personally, that's what I'm clinging to is my hope and faith in God. God's given me, I've read through the Bible several times since all this has happened to me, and God has given so many promises in Scripture that He will vindicate, and He doesn't promise that we won't have to go through the river, that we won't have to go through the fire, but He promises to carry us through. And I just would hope that the church wakes up in this country and begins to speak out on all of these things. They're introspective, they're in their own little cocoon, and as long as it's not happening to them, they're okay. But the problem is, it's happening to me, it's happening to Ken Miller, it's happening to Lisa Miller, it's happening to other people, and eventually it's going to come to them, where they're going to have to take a stand and decide, am I going to turn my back on Christ and what I believe, or am I going to have to take a stand? And it's time people realize now's the time. This same thing happened in Nazi Germany. The Christians buried their heads in the sand until it was too late. They buried their heads in the sand while they came after the Jews, and when they started coming after the Christians, it was too late.
Much too late. If Philip, if you were to be part of a congressional hearing, what would be the shank of your message that you would want to deliver to, the congressional panel?
Oh, that's a good question. I have to think and pray on that a lot. But I say, this nation's in dire shape. We've thumbed our nose at God. We've spit in His face, and it's time we repent as a nation, or God's judgment is going to come down on us hard. It's already coming down on us hard, I believe.
Well, we're finding out that the Christians are the least important class anymore, and I don't like to necessarily put people in a class, but we're seeing it happen in the Middle East. We're seeing it with these various cases here in the United States, as I mentioned, Little Sisters of the Poor and the football coach, and the people, the bakers that refuse to bake a cake, for a gay wedding, and they've lost their businesses, and so at what point I think we've heard one or more have actually gone to the Supreme Court, and I think we have to wait until June for some of these decisions. It's almost unspeakable where we are, and I would say that part of your presentation to members of Congress are saying, why aren't you guys work for us, and we're begging for your help here, and everything falls silent. Would that be a good enough presentation, do you think, for them?
Well, I think that's very true. The power of the ballot box is huge, and it's unfortunately, most of our elected politicians, they run from taking stands, particularly moral stands, ethical stands, because of the media pigeonholing them and putting them in a category, which, I can understand from the perspective of being reelected, but is it morally right to do that?
Mm-hmm.
It's time that they stand on principle, and it's time that the church rally around those people that stand on principle. Look at how many don't vote. Look at how many don't get involved.
Well, the entire case, Philip, is really quite compelling. And when we see, people like Mark Zuckerberg, who was given 2 days worth of testimony on how he runs Facebook and what he takes off of Facebook, from a censorship standpoint, his whole platform is we want to connect people and, do things that are good for the world. So in the case of Lisa Miller, in the case of Ken Miller, Linda Wall, and you, I would say here's a great situation that, social media ought to be embracing for all the right reasons, and that is the First Amendment. I mean, that is a protection of ours that has been, chipped away at for a very long time. Mm-hmm. Agreed?
Yeah, definitely.
Well, we wish you, some luck here with whatever decision comes down, and we certainly hope a higher power in the Almighty, are giving you the will and the strength and the protections that you deserve, because you put up the courage and you did the right thing, something that was not just in your faith but in your heart, human to human. And so we appreciate your time here, Philip.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate everybody's prayers. Especially my appeal would be successful, and that they would overturn my conviction, and that they would not try me a second time if it is overturned.
Yeah, certainly on the civil side. Well, we're going to certainly keep up. Do you have some kind of a site? I know that we've got the millercase.org. Do you have some kind of a site here, Philip?
Not personally. Like I mentioned, there was a lady that put up 419fund.com on my behalf. So she posts updates, and if you get on their email list, she sends out updates from time to time.
Excellent. Well,
419fund.com.
419fund.com. Philip, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And not for your time, but really for your courage in all of this. I wish there were more like you, and maybe we can, through this interview, through this segment, we could do some force multiplying when it comes to religious protections.
Thank you.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for being with us, but there's more coming your way, so stay tuned.
The truth. The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3.
Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for hanging with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Tim Snowball's with us again, and never met Tim, but I feel like he's like a son. Not a prodigal son, but one that you'd almost like to have in addition to the family, because this guy just knows liberty inside and out, and so I want this audience to kind of sit back and listen to where we're going to go, because we're going to talk about how far afield we are today. And Tim has written is it a 10-part series, Tim?
10-part series, yeah.
10-part series. And he's going to explain to us just what kind of a stupid place we're in. But Tim is with the Pacific Legal Foundation. You can go over to pacificlegal.org/the greatest threat to liberty, and his whole series is there. Fascinating reading, and thank you, Tim, for doing this, because sometimes we need a check. We need to kind of be brought back into the space that we need to be in, instead of out there in some weird parallel universe. So thanks for being with us.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Denise, and it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I think that, whenever I have some time scheduled with you, I always have to have about 15 minutes at the beginning, because I think that you and I both like to chat. And I think it's a little, every time we have a call scheduled, we have a little appetizer conversation before we even get on the air. So
well, we talk about Disney and beards and girlfriends and yeah.
Oh. Beards and girlfriends I could talk about all day, but I say my motivation for writing this series, and no one here at Pacific Legal Foundation asked me to do this. This was an idea that I had, just kind of paying attention. I try to pay as little attention as possible, I think, to what's going on in the news. And I don't know if that makes me kind of trying to avoid a lot of this ugliness, or if I'm just kind of burnt out on it. I remember, when I was a teenager or a younger man, I would always watch CNN and MSNBC and whatnot, and I felt like I was really being informed about what was going on. And the last few times that I've tried to turn on one of these networks, it's just, I don't know if I'm the weird one, or if it's unwatchable to me.
Yes,
I just can't even, I can't stomach it, right? And I think that, unfortunately, a lot of Americans, that's their only exposure to politics or what makes for good government, or even commentary on some of these issues. And so my idea behind writing this series was really to get back to first principles. A lot of the problems that the United States has in the modern age, I think, can be remedied by getting back to a lot of the ideas upon which the country was founded, and the structure of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so in this series that as you mentioned, is available on our website, I kind of trace the evolution, I think, from some of the ideas that the country was founded upon, how those manifested themselves in the institutions of government, and then kind of how the Supreme Court, and obviously I'm a lawyer, so I'm kind of focused more on the judicial aspect of it, but how the Supreme Court in subsequent years, in certain cases, had moved away from that ideal. And I highlight, I think, probably 5 of the worst Supreme Court decisions that were ever decided in the history of the country to exemplify this. And then wrap it up talking about PLF and some of the work we do here.
Tim, in doing this work, I know that it took you a long time to do this 10-part series and kind of study the whole thing. But when you finished, was your finished product very different than what you thought it was going to be when you started with part 1?
Well, it's interesting when you have an idea for something. I remember when I had first gone back to college, and I think I had mentioned to you last time that I was a reentry student, so that I had dropped out of high school and gone back to college at an older age. So I didn't write my first kind of research-type paper in college until I was like 25 or 26. And I remember sitting down, and it was just such an effort to get this thing out on paper, and it just felt like so much work and so long. And it's funny now, because I think having gone through college, studying political science, then going on to law school, and now being an attorney, all I do all day for the most part is read, think, and write. And so I don't know if that means I've just gotten a taste for this stuff, but I really enjoyed writing this, sitting down and the actual grind of doing it. You have kind of a general idea, I think, for each piece of where you want to go and where you want to take it. and then you might sketch out kind of a brief outline of where you want to go, but then it's almost as if you get to a certain point where the piece kind of has a mind of its own almost, and as you're writing it, the ideas present themselves, and you must necessarily go in a given direction. So I really, obviously, I've gotten to the point where I'm much more happy being doing writing. I think people think of attorneys and they think of the guy with gray hair from Law and Order who gets up and every time you see him, he's thundering away at a witness on the stand. I mean, being in court is a big part of being an attorney, obviously. But I think most attorneys would aptly be described as professional writers.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, Tim, where we are today is, we have the Bill of Rights, and we have some amendments here, and these things are protection tools for us. And yet, I don't know at what point this whole thing went sideways, and I think it was a very slow evolution to all of this. But we now have an administrative state that has eaten away piece by piece, bite by bite at all of our protections. And the one that really, I think, gets to me most is the First Amendment, all of those. The Second Amendment, we've got organizations that are out there working diligently to protect that as best they can. So I kind of jump over that one. But then we got the Fourth Amendment that I think is a big problem. And that's where the administrative state, I think, reveals its ugly head the most. Would you agree? Or, you're the lawyer.
Yeah, sure. And I think that, in talking about the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, it's important to begin with first principles, right? And so the first piece that I write, I titled, "Government is not the source of our rights." And let me explain that. So there were certain ideas upon which the country was founded, as exemplified in the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson that begins the Declaration by discussing natural rights and the source of our rights. And for Jefferson and the other founders, our rights were not a gift of the government. It wasn't as if the government was deciding, here's what you can and can't do, and here are your rights to be modified at will. For Jefferson and the other founders, our rights pre-existed the existence of government itself. Mm-hmm. And whether you look to the origin of rights being from God, from a religious aspect, or whether, as Jefferson describes it, they're self-evident through the very nature of mankind as rational thinking beings. Either way, our rights to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness are said to precede government. Now, there are certain effects that has in terms of what you're talking about when it comes to good government and bad government, right? So if rights precede government, then governments exist. Their only legitimate end is to secure our rights. Governments have no rights themselves. They only have powers that were delegated by the people. And so the entire purpose is really for government to protect our natural rights. And there's this interesting section, I think, that people always quote. The Declaration of Independence is laid out in three main sections. You have the opening section that I was just quoting from. That's kind of the preamble. That's kind of the famous section that people always think about when they talk about it, Jefferson's famous words. The second part is this long listing of grievances that the colonists, former colonists, alleged against the King of England. And then the last portion, of course, is the actual, they pull the trigger and separate from Great Britain politically. But it's an interesting thing that Jefferson, kind of the overall arching point of the Declaration is, when government ceases to fulfill its role in protecting natural rights, the people have a right to modify or rescind their government and make new government. And that's something, of course, that the country never embraced.
Yeah, we never seem to get to that part, do we?
You know what I mean? But it's interesting. I think that, if you're going to talk about the United States, you have to begin with these first principles, right? And you talking about the different aspects of the Bill of Rights. I mean, in the original Constitution, there was no Bill of Rights. When they wrote the original Constitution, of course, they had this 10-year period after the Revolutionary War during the Articles of Confederation where they were they had this Confederate-style government where it was more of a loose alliance. The central government had no real power. Nothing could get done. They couldn't levy taxes. They couldn't they couldn't have an army. They couldn't do anything. There was no national court system. And so when the delegates got together in Philadelphia about 10 years after the end of the Revolutionary War to make the Constitution, they designed the Constitution specifically, structurally, to preserve individual liberty. So, not only do we have these philosophic ideas of Jefferson and the other founders as the basis for the Constitution, but the Constitution itself was specifically designed to limit government power, to preserve individual liberty, to the degree to which the people who were supporting the Constitution, when there were calls for a Bill of Rights, said, "Well, why do we need a Bill of Rights? If it's not listed, if it's not listed here, then government can't do it."
Good point.
I think that looking back, of course, at those historical figures, they may have been a little bit naive or a little bit maybe overly optimistic. But ultimately, even those rights that were ultimately granted in the bill, or granted or recognized in the Bill of Rights, those aren't things that the government is supposed to arbitrarily be able to modify. You know what I mean? It's not as if they say, well, Congress can make no law respecting an establishment of religion unless they really, really want to. Or, the First Amendment, speech protection, that's really, really important. But the Second Amendment protection for the right to bear arms, that's just there until we kind of decide that we don't want that anymore. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so what you've seen happen, because there can't be this kind of frontal assault through the legislature on the Bill of Rights or on, affecting the powers of the federal government, what you've seen more often than not are, unfortunately, federal judges stepping in and kind of inserting their own politics or their own kind of policy preferences in place of what the Constitution or other laws require. And I think that's a real problem.
I hear some of these politicians, many of them, that say things like regulate, no right is absolute, that government, whatever kind of government, state, local, federal, has the ability to have these stipulations to rights. And that's when things start going really gray and hazy and nasty. And there was, I would say, a very long period of time, 100 years, maybe more, that we just sort of like, well, you can't sue the government. I mean, I remember all that for many years as a younger kid. You just kind of roll with it. I mean, there was nobody really challenging any of these. And Pacific Legal, I mean, you guys do stellar work challenging all these little teeny cases. And there are other cases that, come out of the Supreme Court that you guys want to start, smacking people over, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that really cuts to the heart of it when it comes to, the role of not only attorneys, in our Republican system of government, but also judges, right? I mean, when you look at the Constitution, the words of the Constitution, I also recommend any of your readers who aren't familiar with it or haven't read it yet, the Federalist Papers. I don't know if you, Denise, have read the Federalist Papers at all, but the Federalist Papers were a series of articles. So they had completed the Constitution, and they had submitted it out to the states for ratification. Well, in the interim, of course, there were major debates going on. And so it was James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay were all Federalists. That was the party who supported the new Constitution. They had written a series of articles in, I think it was New York newspapers, encouraging the New York delegation to vote in favor of the new Constitution. And the Federalist, as it's become, after they compiled all of the articles into one book, is just an incredible snapshot into the ideas and the psyches, and I think the bases for many things that you find in the Constitution. And it's an opportunity, I think, it's really incredible to have these three founding fathers explain in detail the reasons why they did or did not do certain things. And one of the things that they discuss in the Federalist is the unique role of judges in our constitutional system. Because when you look at our tripartite government, the legislature has the power to legislate. The legislature makes the laws, generally speaking. The executive branch or the president is the one who enforces the laws and is responsible for executing the laws as passed by Congress. The only role that judges have is to judge the law and to judge the constitutionality of the law in light of individual rights. And while I say that's the only power they have, that's still an extremely important check upon what the other branches are doing. And Madison talks about this at length, that judges uniquely will be the protectors of individual rights in our system. And unfortunately, as I mentioned, you see just a long trend, not always, but a long trend of different examples of judges stepping in and either refusing to protect individual rights in favor of an expansion of government power, or when presented with the opportunity to protect individual rights, kind of, punting the ball and refusing to do that. And I think that that's not always the case, but unfortunately, I don't know if you've heard of, have you ever heard of the phrase judicial activism?
Oh, yes.
Judicial activism. Well, I'll speak for a moment about that, because like the modern debate over judges seems to be between these two concepts of judicial activism versus judicial restraint. So people who argue against judicial activism will say, these judges are overstepping their bounds a lot of times and deciding these issues that they shouldn't be deciding, and their only, job is really to apply the law. And I think that that's correct in terms of judges' ruling should be, based on and grounded in the original meaning of the text they're looking at. Law is language. But on the other side of the aisle, you have people saying, well, judicial restraint. Judges should do absolutely nothing more than is necessary to decide the narrow issues before them. And again, I also agree with that if it's grounded within, the original meaning of the Constitution and what the text of the law requires. But I think that debate really misses the point, because when it comes to judging, and a lot of modern judges refusing to prioritize individual rights over government power, you really have an issue of judicial abdication, where judges are abdicating their constitutionally prescribed role to protect individual rights. And to that point, the school of thought that I kind of embrace, and I think a lot of libertarian or conservative lawyers might embrace, would be the concept of judicial engagement, which is judges should be engaged with the actual facts of the case before them, and leave their own personal politics out of it.
I'm kind of struck by what you said there, because I don't know of a case, and I don't watch it like lawyers do, but it would be very fascinating to sit in a room with the news, or when we're arguing something on the House floor or the Senate floor, or some bill is up for a vote or something, and then have a judge and a lawyer say, I wouldn't do this, or don't do that, or this law is stupid, it doesn't fit. And you know what I'm saying, is such that a judge would go, why are you writing this law? It's against everything. Or why are you bringing me this case? You lawyers are nuts, and this is, right. You know what I'm saying? I mean, the law itself is stupid. I mean, Obamacare. I mean, we can just go down the line here.
Well, sure. Right. Well, let me give you an example, right? So, I mean, you mentioned the Bill of Rights. I mean, as a political compromise, the entire reason that the Bill of Rights, as I mentioned, the people who had originally promulgated the Constitution, they didn't include it. There was no Bill of Rights. That was a later addition, because they said, look, we set up the structure of the federal government in such a way that if the power to do something isn't explicitly listed here, the government won't be able to do it, right? But as a compromise with the Anti-Federalists, they wound up including a Bill of Rights into the Constitution. And so the entire purpose of the Bill of Rights is to list things that the government should, individual rights that the government is not allowed to violate. That is the entire point. It doesn't matter how many people want to violate it. If it becomes popular, if all of a sudden you've got bunch of high school kids who decide that they're public policy experts and they want to come out and say whatever they want to say. I mean, they've got free speech to say whatever they want to say, but it really doesn't matter how many people want to modify any of this stuff. It's supposed to be untouchable. That's really the point. And so I'll give you an example, because as time went on, as opposed to protecting the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, judges became more and more apt to not protect individual rights or liberty because a majority of people, or a legislature, a Democratic legislature, had voted on something, right? So I'll give you an example of one of the cases I talk about in this series. It's this case from 1927 called Buck v. Bell. It is one of the most egregious constitutional law cases that I've ever read. Have you heard of this one before?
I haven't.
Okay, so in Buck v. Bell, the state of Virginia had passed a law, this is the early 20th century, that was basically a law that would allow the state to forcibly sterilize people who were found by the state to be mentally handicapped.
Mm-hmm.
All right? So there was this poor woman named Carrie Buck who, the details aren't exactly clear, but she had been, they think, somewhat promiscuous and had been impregnated with child, and there was all this controversy, and so eventually she had been placed into a mental institution. Okay? Come to find out later that she wasn't mentally deficient at all, that this had actually all been something contrived. But as applied by that statute, the state was going to step in and sterilize her against her will. And that statute had been challenged, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And basically when it got to the Supreme Court, this type of law that many Americans wouldn't even have heard of, it's so egregious and so immoral and so unconstitutional on its face that you would think, like, well, how could the Supreme Court not just step in and say, well, this is obviously completely uncalled for and completely illegal, we're going to throw out the books. Instead, the court went, well, this was passed by a Democratic majority in the legislature, and who are we to step in and say that this is wrong? This is not our place.
That
to step
really
in and
defines that defines where we are today. That really goes to my question. Like, what the heck?
What I mean? And this was the famous quote from the Supreme Court justice who wrote this was, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. that was the quote. And so, it just, unfortunately, the situation only kind of wound up kind of getting worse from there. But, your listeners should know that just because a law is passed by a Democratic majority, whether that be Congress or any state legislature, that doesn't automatically mean that it's constitutional or even moral. I mean,
that's my
especially
point.
in terms of morality.
We're coming into a break. So poor Tim can breathe here, and we got a lot more on the other side here, ladies and gentlemen. So you absolutely cannot go away. So everybody kind of sit back for a second, and we'll see you on the other side of the break.
Hi, thank you for listening. My name is Ron Phillips, and I'm the owner and operations manager of Talk America Radio. It is with great pride that I offer you this 24/7 stream of some of the finest talk radio programming in the country, but I need your support. We are a listener-supported network. That means we need your help to continue to offer the quality programming you're hearing right now. If you're able, please visit talkamericaradio.us and click the Support Us button. Your donation will go a long way in helping us continue to share the American voice. Thank you.
This is Don Newen, co-host of the Drive Time Sit Rep. Join me as I call in to my Intel analyst, Denise Simon, for my daily situation report, or Sit Rep, the Drive Time Sit Rep. Check talkamericaradio.us for more information and show times.
Let me talk to you, black people. When you vote for blacks and put them in office under the banner of the Democrat Party, please explain to me what black people get as a result. This was not a nap that we have been taking. We are in a coma. You know what the interesting thing about pensions is? That's today's money given to people who ain't doing nothing for you today. Get off that black Democrat tit that they've been sucking on. Your country is being stolen from you, and the promise is being stolen from your children, and they're telling you it's all right while the rest of the world is trying to lap us. Well, why are we doing so poorly? 2 words: teachers' unions. Are you kidding me?
Black Man Thinking, Monday nights, 9 p.m.
This is Denise Simon, host of the Denise Simon Experience. When I'm not debating with Donna Fiducia about politics, I listen to Cowboy Logic Radio. Why, you ask? Because outside of my blog, founderscode.com, and my own radio show, the Denise Simon Experience, Cowboy Logic is by far the most entertaining and informative radio show on planet Earth. Plus, Don makes me feel guilty if I don't listen to his radio show every week.
You're listening to your local news source, WLBB, News Talk 1330 and FM 106.3.
KTA Digital Dallas. Talk America Radio. Simulcasting on WDDQ, Talk 92.1, Adel, Valdosta, Georgia, and WJHC, Talk 107.5, Jasper, Florida.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for staying with us. We've been having a fascinating conversation here with Tim Snowball, who has written a 10-part series on liberties, if you will, over at pacificlegal.org, the greatest threat to liberty. And before we went to break, we were talking about one of the more egregious cases that Tim mentioned, Buck versus Bell. It takes us back into the 1920s, where they were going to sterilize a woman because they thought she was nuts. I'm actually thinking lobotomies at this point might be a good thing. But some of these people now.
Didn't they already? I thought isn't that already public policy up for members of Congress? I thought that was already.
Yes.
You know, I need a little drum set in the background. Okay.
Yeah. So, but I don't think any of us are taking a lot of what your series is about, and that is liberty, seriously as we should. I mean, for instance, let's talk about pot being illegal, or some other class something or other narcotic. I would imagine at some point, Tim, there was a time like, a 10-year-old drinking alcohol or having a beer, that wasn't a law necessarily on the books, just because society or parents were very involved, that they wouldn't allow that for their children. And now, because the government has become this administrative state, those parental decisions, if you will, have been deferred, because the government is making those decisions for those parents. So we've now, as an example, we've kind of convoluted all of the behavioral limitations as we, as a civilized people, we have these laws that are dictating behavior going, and so then these rights are no longer necessarily equal. The law isn't necessarily equal, and we are in a convoluted mess, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I've got 3 kind of points on what you're saying. I mean, number one is, the United States, one of the reasons that the United States is absolutely unique among all of the other countries in the history of the world. I mean, you look back, pre-17th century, and there were a few defining characteristics for politics or the ruling class. It was basically either you had a title, a hereditary title that came down that gave you claim to certain property, or lands, or you just had a bigger army. And those two things gave you the right to tell people what they could and could not do. I mean, the United States is the first country in the history of the world that wasn't founded on ideas about land or wealth,
nobility,
or nobility. Right. We were founded upon a specific set of ideas having to do with individual liberty and equality and the right to possess and use property. That up till that point had never. There were philosophers in Great Britain and elsewhere who had started to talk about these ideas, but this is the first time they'd ever been put into practice. And I think at least for me, I mean, that is still the measure against which I analyze and I look at public policy. Nothing has changed in human nature or government to a degree to which these ideas are any less applicable now as they were in 1776. And to that end, when you're talking about civil society versus the government, and you're talking about the role of parents or family or cultural institutions,
morality.
I mean, that's one of the main things. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the main things I think that people on the left kind of get wrong about people of a more libertarian persuasion, because they'll say, well, look, humans are not these solitary creatures, that we individuals thrive and need to be part of communities, and it's some of the most fulfilling, relationships and things that you can have in your life, and that, the only way, but here's the difference, though. I think that up until that point, the two camps would be in agreement. But the point at which I think that liberals or those of the left make a mistake is they say, and government is the only way that we can foster those relationships or build those institutions. And I think that's absolutely incorrect. You've got civil society, which is made up of individuals, voluntary associations, churches, family, other extended networks that have absolutely nothing to do with the government. And that's society. And then separate from that, not above it, but separate from that, you have the government. And the idea that you must, kind of co-opt this power, this coercive power of the state to bring about these changes, I think is absolutely incorrect. And to that end, I think that ties back in with what you were talking about when it comes to the administrative state. I mean, we have discussed this problem at length before, and you turn on the news or go on Twitter or any of these other things, and people are talking about what Trump said today, and is he going to get the Nobel Peace Prize and all of this, and it's all just such distraction and nonsense, because we have this fourth branch of government, this unelected administrative state that has the judicially sanctioned power to regulate nearly every single aspect of our lives. And you are much more likely to have your individual liberties threatened or be affected by the machinations of the administrative state than anything Congress is going to do. I mean, for all intents and purposes, Congress doesn't even pass the laws anymore.
They're lobbyists. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Part 7 of your series, liberty is more important than security, because I would argue if all the amendments in the Bill of Rights are our shields, then we can provide our own security in an effort to preserve liberty. Did I get that right? I'm not sure I said that right, but I
think to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, there's a famous quote that I always think of by Benjamin Franklin that really sums this up, and I think it's somewhere I might mangle this, but it's something along the lines of, those who would sacrifice essential liberty for some small promise of security deserve neither liberty nor security, right? But the idea being that, all too often, we can see this throughout history, individuals and groups willing to give up their rights or give up their liberties because of fear, because they're afraid, right? And this ties in with one of the cases that I had talked about in the series, the case of Fred Korematsu. And this is a famous case, Korematsu versus the United States, that you may have read about in American history class, but everyone knows about how World War II began in terms of U.S. involvement with the attack on Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
There was a big push after that in the media, and times have changed, but I would argue some blatant racism at the time. That Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and by the way, I mean I had happened across, I think it was a relative. So I have a couple of younger cousins or nieces and nephews that are still in high school. I happened across someone's American history book and opened it up at random to this section on FDR, and I'll tell you, FDR. I want to go on a tangent here. Was probably hands down the most destructive president to the American constitutional order of any president in history. I mean, just example after example after example. And the fact that he is like venerated as this godlike figure in this standardized American history. I don't want to go off on a tangent. I'm thinking I was talking to somebody on social media about it last night, and a former professor of mine, he says, Tim, why don't you write a book about it? I said, if I find the time, I will, because there's more than enough material. But anyways, this was yet another, so the case of Korematsu is just another example of FDR really just being egregious. So he enacts an executive order, several executive orders, which basically lead to over 100,000 men, women, and children of Japanese and Asian descent basically being put into concentration camps on the West Coast in the wake of Pearl Harbor. And something like 60% of these individuals were American citizens. These weren't people who just came across the ocean and got off the boat. You know what I mean? These were people who had full American citizenship, were working and living in the United States, owning property here, that were basically stripped of their rights because of public fear. And the case went to the Supreme Court, and in unfortunate fashion, the court said, yes, there are individual rights. However, this is a state of emergency, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really just a troubling case. I think it's a troubling trend that you saw kind of repeated, I think, in the wake of the attacks of September 11th.
Yeah.
And I think that every time that there's something to be afraid of, the media will stoke that fire. Politicians will stoke that fire to their own ends. And I think you can even observe it with, all the controversy down there over the Second Amendment in your neck of the woods, And you can show somebody all the evidence that you have, saying, look, there's no gun violence crisis in the United States. It just doesn't exist. Gun violence is at a 30-year low. But that won't matter when someone's afraid, because their judgment gets muddled by fear. It's an unfortunate thing that I think all too often the government will step in and take advantage of.
You mentioned in one particular part of the series the Chevron doctrine. What is that?
Yeah, and that actually ties right in perfectly with what you're talking about in terms of the administrative state. Chevron doctrine arose from a case, I think it was in the early 80s in 1984, where the court had been trying to figure out the interpretation of a certain statute that was affecting the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, had promulgated, having to do with sources of pollution, right? And under one interpretation, sources of pollution had been categorized as individual pollution-producing machinery. So, like, as opposed to looking at, like, a whole factory, you would look at individual machines or apparatuses within the factory that were producing pollution. The alternative interpretation had been to look at the entire factory in this bubble theory, I think they called it, of looking at it in terms of pollution. That's really kind of aside from the real issue before the court, which was who has the power to decide what the law means, right? So when it comes to administrative agencies, Congress passes laws creating or empowering administrative agencies, right? But a lot of time, the language that Congress uses is not as precise as it could be. It's kind of ambiguous. So when it comes to the congressional mandate, the court is trying to decide who decides. Should we give deference to the agency who are supposed to be the experts on this stuff? Or should we as judges step in and make this decision? And, the Chevron doctrine was a result of that case, and it's just one of the most harmful and egregious doctrines promulgated by the court in the last 30 years. Basically, the court said that federal courts have to take a hands-off kind of approach to this, that when Congress has passed a statute affecting an administrative agency or area of administration, that if it's kind of ambiguous, they will defer to the agency's interpretations of the statute in their own power. Now, I want you to kind of take a moment and compare that to the system of government as set up by a James Madison, right? So Madison would say individuals, even with the best intentions, have a tendency toward abusing their own power. Therefore, we have to build a government of divided and limited powers, as specifically to make sure that no individual in government will ever be able to abuse their power and harm individual rights. Compare that with the people that we're going to place in the positions, the most powerful positions in the government, should be empowered to decide what their own limits on their power is. I mean, it's such a gross.
I like what you said, but I hate what you said.
I mean, it's such a gross departure, and I mean that among others has been just the absolute one of the worst doctrines to be promulgated. I mean, you combine that with other stuff like I talk about in the series, absolute power corrupts absolutely, the Wickard v. Silburn case. I mean, they're just, it's been a slow roll, from the founding through. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the United States, not only as Americans should we have pride in kind of the heritage of the ideas upon which the country was founded, and even as much as the country throughout history in different contexts have departed from those principles, we've also kept to them to a greater or lesser extent. And I mean, the United States Constitution is the most successful, most copied, most envied founding document in the history of the world, right? And, while the fight goes on, through organizations like my own, like Pacific Legal Foundation, it's a fight worth having. And as long as the fight is ongoing, there's still a battle to be won and to be waged. So all hope is not lost. Hopefully this interview was at certain points kind of a downer, but
well, it's not. But here's the fascinating thing about that: because our Constitution is so successful, it's a mind blow that other nations, and I would argue Britain, Magna Carta, that whole thing. Why are these other nations failing when this is a model that is still envied today? I mean, what are we seeing at our southern border where we got a caravan that's coming in, and we got to throw all kinds of resources because these people want to get here for whatever reasons, good, bad, or indifferent, and yet they're leaving Guatemala, they're leaving Honduras, they're leaving El Salvador and Nicaragua and China and God knows where else. Right. It's a mind blow that here's the model. You guys can come here for 2 years, study it, learn it, see it, touch it, live it, and then go back and be your own advocates, right?
It's a tough thing. I mean, when you read, I was reading something from, I think, James Madison the other day. I've got a big stack of books in my office I'm trying to work my way slowly through, outside of just, I guess it's work related, but it's also just the pleasure of my own study. But Madison's talking about recognizing the unique point in history that was presented to the founders, where they said, you know what, never before has anyone tried to do something like this before. Never before has someone tried to set up a country where they will limit their own powers. I mean, George Washington could have won the Revolutionary War, and then he was so popular and so powerful, he could have declared himself king. I think someone offered that to him. I think that a group of founders at one point got together and said, "Hey, we're going to set the new government. We want you to be
king.
We want you to be the new monarch." And he said, "No, of course I'm not going to do that." Not only did he not do that, he refused that, but at the point at which his second term ended as president, the peaceful transfer of power from one democratically elected individual to another, that is just astounding. And even now in the United States, I mean, say what you want about modern politics, but the image on Inauguration Day of whether it be a George W. Bush passing power to Barack Obama or Barack Obama passing power to Donald Trump, it is just a remarkable thing. And so to your point in regards to other countries, I think they're going to be liberty-loving individuals all over, and I think that when it comes to some of those countries that you mentioned in Central or South America, I definitely think that the flaws inherent in socialist-type systems are being laid bare. If anybody needed any reinforcement of why these things fail again and again and again and again, is not only because they violate basic laws of economics, but they violate basic laws of morality and individual liberty. And systems like that are destined to fail. And so I would hope, I think it was Reverend John Winthrop or someone else during the Great Awakening in the colonial era, kind of had been echoed by Ronald Reagan, in the 80s, talking about the United States as a city on a hill, right? And I as much as we contend with each other and argue and fight about public policy or politics or anything else, just the fact that we can have those debates and have that contention means that we're still living in a free country. And it'll only be the day at which we are forced to agree or we don't have the options to dissent. Then I think we're in real trouble.
Well, I can't argue with any of that. That's certainly well said. I have this vision, and you're going to have to put me in my place, because I want very badly for a panel of Tim Snowball lawyers to sit before a joint session of Congress and shame them. With much of the conversation that we've had here today, would that not be a bucket list dream?
I certainly would not be opposed to doing something like that. If there's any local members of Congress out there in Florida that are listening to this or anywhere else, if you're sitting on a committee somewhere and you want to set that up, I'm sure that I've got some colleagues in Florida from our Florida office, so I'm sure would love to participate in that.
But you know what I'm saying? If you, Tim, you're going to have to go watch the news, and then you're going to have to go, just watch it for one day, and then just go, we need a joint session of Congress, and we need, a Jonathan Turley, and we need a Tim Snowball, and, some of these others that are living in the spirit of these founding documents that can just shame these people.
Turley is someone that I definitely have a lot of respect for. He was he is a professor at George Washington University, where I went for law school, and I had known of him before I even went there, and was hoping to study with him and take a class with him, but unfortunately, I think that he was on sabbatical.
Probably hired by John Boehner.
He was otherwise unavailable, but I mean, there's. If all your audience hasn't seen this, go on YouTube and type in Jonathan Turley. He's a professor of law, and he's been involved with several lawsuits and testifying in front of different committees and stuff. And I'll never forget this one particular committee. I don't remember it was something about congressional power. And
I think I told you about that. I think I told you to go watch that. It was a remarkable.
Yeah, because he goes, ladies and gentlemen of the committee, he goes, I've been somebody who's considered myself kind of liberal on many political issues for decades. He goes, not all of them, but there are certain issues that I've looked to where I've had more of a affinity for, positions on the left. And he says, and President Obama came into office and through executive orders enacted a lot of the things that I had hoped to see happen. He goes, but I don't support those policies because even though they jive with my personal political preferences, laws are supposed to be passed by Congress. And he goes, if Congress can't get together and agree and come to some consensus on these things, then they shouldn't be enacted through the stroke of a pen of an executive. And I found that to be very inspiring. That back when I was still very optimistic in my pre-law school years.
I loved that. In fact, I think I loved that session. I mean, to the point where the House of Representatives were thinking about passing another piece of legislation to reassert their power as one half of the legislative government, because of what was happening in the Obama administration, which was a remarkable show of colossal frustrations of what had happened or what was happening in the during the Obama administration. But Tim Snowball, this has just been so much fun. Get perspective and to kind of come back into center where we need to be. And ladies and gentlemen, please, please, please visit pacificlegal.org and then look at The Greatest Threat to Liberty, which is Tim's 10-part series. If for nothing else, it just kind of takes you back where we need to be in the spirit of the founding documents and not, judicial activism or, modern day interpretations, which is clearly what's going on today. We're grateful for your hard work on all of this, Tim, and your dedication to the work. It's kind of refreshing to know that you guys over there at Pacific Legal are just on the side of the we little guys.
Well, it's our pleasure, and I think that the unique thing here amongst us and even other like-minded organizations is we don't look at this work as a 9-to-5 that we have to kind of drag our feet in to go to work every day. This is really, for many of us, I think, a calling.
Yeah,
so it goes well beyond just a day-to-day grind. It's really kind of a mission.
Well, it's in the DNA for sure. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, and we'll see you again real soon.